Paul counted on his generous donation to create goodwill in Jerusalem, and he hoped it would ensure that he'd be well received. But in spite of Paul's gifts, Philip the deacon's warning would prove prophetic. When Paul and Luke arrived in Jerusalem, they met with James and the other Christian elders.
They have been told about you, that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses.
Paul quickly ran into trouble, and a crowd of hostile Jews began to beat him. They cried out,
"Fellow Israelites, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against our people, our law, and this place."
The crowd dragged Paul out of the temple and began to assault him violently. The Roman commander led his soldiers to the scene of the riot. When the mob saw the drawn swords, they stopped beating Paul. While the soldiers bound Paul with chains, the commander asked him what he'd done. Meanwhile, the angry crowd shouted out accusations against him. The commander ordered Paul to be interrogated, but when Paul said he was a Roman citizen, the commander became frightened and turned him over to the Jewish high priests. Imprisoned, Paul learned that 40 Jews had taken an oath to kill him. He was sent to Caesarea under heavy guard, but soon faced accusations of crimes against Judaism before the Roman procurator, Antonius Felix.
We have, in fact, found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes.
Paul responded that he had only gone to Jerusalem to bring alms and offerings, and that he was even purified in the temple.
Paul was placed under house arrest here in Caesarea for 2 years. Imagine what a frustrating experience that must have been for a man of his boundless energy. Towards the end of this time, he feared judgment and imprisonment at the hands of the authorities in Jerusalem. To avoid this, he invoked his right as a Roman citizen to be judged by the emperor, a significant moment as he turned his back on his Jewish past.
Paul said, "I am appealing to the emperor's tribunal. This is where I should be tried. I appeal to the emperor."
There was to be one more set-piece hearing, this time before the grandson of Herod the Great. Paul passionately outlined his beliefs, and he insisted he had done nothing to wrong the Jews or the Romans. The king was so impressed, he said he almost converted on the spot. But the Romans insisted. He had appealed to Rome, and to Rome he must go.
After 2 years as a prisoner in Caesarea, Paul's voyage to Rome aboard an Egyptian grain ship began. But as Paul sailed towards Italy, the weather worsened dramatically. Halfway through the voyage, the skies turned dark and the winds blew violently. The powerful storm pushed the ship to the island of Malta, where it was wrecked. The 274 passengers, half of them prisoners, made it to shore by either swimming or floating on pieces of wreckage. Miraculously, there was no loss of life. Paul stayed in Malta for 3 months, where he is still held in huge veneration today for the miracles he performed. Once the west winds began to blow again, Paul could continue his journey, and he landed in Puteoli, 150 miles from Rome. This road is called the Appian Way. Paul himself came along here when he was brought to Rome as a prisoner around the year 61. The book of Acts tells us that many people came to see the famous man. We also learn that the apostle was fortified by the strong Christian presence here. Seneca was also a tutor and advisor to Nero, who became emperor at the age of 17. The Rome that Paul would enter was controlled by Emperor Nero, who by this time had been in power for a decade. For a period, the empire enjoyed sound government. Nero improved public order, and he applied himself rigorously to his judicial duties. By the year 62, Nero's reign would change completely. After murdering his mother in a political plot, Nero's life became a series of excesses in games, music, orgies, and murder. By the time Paul arrived in Rome, Nero was almost certainly deranged. This area was home to the first and largest stadium in ancient Rome. Called the Circus Maximus, it was a third of a mile long and could hold up to 150,000 spectators. It was used for chariot races.
It was in the southeast corner of the stadium that the Great Fire of Rome broke out on the night of the 18th of July in the year 64. It was a monumental blaze. It lasted for 9 days and engulfed over 2/3 of the city.
For the next 2 years, Paul, as a Roman citizen, was allowed house arrest, guarded by a live-in soldier. Paul welcomed all who came to him and tried to explain to Jewish leaders about Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets. Some were convinced by what he said, but others refused to believe. The book of Acts ends before Paul's final days, but tradition says he was eventually moved here, outside the city walls, to this place. It was in this holding cell that a later writer takes on Paul's voice in his last letter to Timothy.
I am already being poured out as a libation, and the time of my departure has come. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. From now on, there is reserved for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing.
According to the tradition, he died in the last quarter of the year 67, and because he was a Roman citizen, it was a clean death by the sword. See, the magistrates should have given him the chance to run. This was standard practice. But the Emperor Nero had established the mere fact of being a Christian meant that you were worthy of death. He had fought the good fight, he had kept the faith, and he wouldn't have wanted to die in any other way.